Hello and welcome to another Hand Drink Solo Wine Info video where today we're talking about Cape Rock Wine's Grenache Noir 2021 made by winemaker Gavin Brand. In this video we'll be talking about Cape Rock Wines as an establishment, then we'll talk about what the wine is like in the glass, and thirdly I'm going to give you 3 less commonly shared facts about Grenache Noir which will almost certainly make you more interesting at dinner parties. The Cape Rock property is an epic 300 kilometers or a 4-hour drive north of Cape Town, which is straight off the top of the lunatic fringe of the north end of Swartland and right into the Olifantsberg wine district. The estate itself is situated between the towns of Vredendal and Klaver, and it's also about 30 kilometers inland from South Africa's west coast, which is where the cooling Atlantic Ocean waits to take its effect. Fans of the recent Hand Drink Solo exploration into climate change cultivars are absolutely going to love these guys because they are wine explorers of the first degree and absolutely hell-bent on vinifying exactly these sorts of cultivars, grapes that are suited to the hot, dry South African climate. On the red cultivar side, they've got Syrah and Grenache and Mourvedre and Carignan, and on the white grape side, they've got things like Colombard or Grenache Blanc and Marsanne and Roussanne, and all of this is packed into 11 hectares stretched out over the plains around the Olifants River. But let's talk about the Grenache Noir 2021. The first thing we notice is the color, because we know that Grenache has thin skins and often delivers low intensity color. But this is ridiculous. One has to ask the question, is this a rosé or isn't it? It's more perplexing than a Rammstein acoustic concert. But it starts to make sense when you realize that Gavin Brand is very much in the ilk of the minimal intervention gang, which means that they often pick their grapes earlier, they only use spontaneous fermentation, and almost always ferment wines in older oak or in concrete vessels. Incidentally, all 3 of those things is true of this particular wine. But perhaps even more relevant in explaining the color of this particular wine is that this wine was made with a fraction that only used free-run juice. When you are fermenting red wines on their skins and seeds and pulp, the juice that can run out of the press without ever having to actually do any pressing is called free-run juice. A little bit later on, one has to actually engage the press and squeeze the must in order to get those later fractions of juice out. And those later fractions usually have a far more intense tannic component and also a far more intense color component. But you might ask, without the tannins and the color and the anthocyanins and the polyphenols, well, my God, man, what is left in this wine? Is it going to be completely void of flavor? Well, I guess to really discover that, you have to find out what's in the glass. When you give this a sniff, your skepticism is fairly quickly allayed because the nose is supremely generous. There's just an array of pink licorice all sorts and Turkish delight and cherry lifesaver and even a little bit of toffee apple and some fresh earth mixed in there. And the nose is just so precise. It's almost as if all of those flavor notes that I mentioned wait patiently in line to introduce themselves to you one at a time rather than just leaping out in a big jumble. It's just the clarity is supreme. Now, when we take a sip, well, the palate does carry on in a similar sort of vein. You get those delightful Turkish delight elements, you get that juicy cherry lifesaver note, but alongside it is an additional element of blood orange and even some fresh cut strawberry fruit, which is really quite enticing. And then right towards the end, there are some ever so fine tannins on the finish, but that's really just to remind you that you are actually a grown-up. One thing's for certain, the wine does not lack complexity, even though it may dance quite lightly on your palate. And finally, because it's nice to learn something new, I'm going to share with you 3 facts about Grenache that perhaps are less likely to have been shared before. So I'm not going to waste your time telling you about how it's one of the top 10 most planted cultivars around the world. I won't bother drudging up the dreary past about how it is the backbone of the historic Chateauneuf-du-Pape blends. I'm not even going to talk about the glut of old vines that can be found in its homeland of Aragon in North Spain. Instead, I'm going to ask you this. Did you know that Grenache was the #1 most planted cultivar in Australia for over 200 years? From the 1700s all the way through to 1960s, there was no cultivar more planted than Grenache. Fact 2, Grenache has many mutant variants, and we know this. We know about Grenache Noir, Grenache Blanc, and even Grenache Gris. But did you know that there is a mutant called hairy Grenache, or Garnacha peluda, which has been known to grow little hairs on the underside of the leaves of the vines in order to protect these leaves during very hot weather conditions. Wines made from Garnacha peluda are reputed to have slightly higher acid and also lower alcohol levels, which seemingly would correct some of the perceived shortcomings to be found in the grape of Grenache. Finally, fact 3, in 1961, Cabernet Sauvignon and Grenache were crossed in order to produce a new cultivar, Marcelin, which is now very popular in the south of France. But relevant for South African audiences, Marcelin has now been planted and grown and vinified in South Africa by Waverley Hills Estate in Tilbach. They are the only estate in South Africa currently to have Marcelin bottled and on sale. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but if you enjoyed the video, then consider subscribing to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we talk about unusual cultivars, wine history, wine science, and some of the rising winemaking stars that are coming out of the South African winelands.